The night she came to his door, the snow had buried 100 miles of empty country, and Calliope Rennick had walked the last 4 of them with no shoes. She had lost the shoes somewhere past the dry creek, when she had to choose between crossing on the slick rocks in her stockings or turning back to the men who had promised to kill her by morning. She had chosen the rocks. She had chosen right. They cut her feet clean to the bone before she made it across, and by the time she saw the thin line of smoke from his chimney, she had stopped being cold. That was how far gone she was. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. The kettle on, the lights low. Tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We love knowing who is with us for this one. The ranch house sat in a saddle between 2 ridges, low and quiet, the kind of place a person could ride past and never see if they weren't looking. The windows glowed amber through the snow. Calliope raised her fist and knocked, and the sound her knuckles made on the wood was so small she wasn't sure anyone heard. She knocked again. A long silence. Then the bolt slid back, and the door opened 6 inches, and a man stood in the gap holding a rifle loosely across his chest. He was tall, narrow through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been hammered out of the same iron he used on his fences. He looked down at her, then down further, at her torn stockings and the dark blood that had turned to ice on her toes. He didn't speak for a long moment. "You alone?" he said. She hadn't spoken aloud in 3 days. It took her 2 tries to make her mouth work. "Please," she said. "Just one night. Anywhere with a roof. I will work for it. I will. You're bleeding on my porch." "Yes, sir." He looked at her another long time. Then he stepped back and held the door open. "My name is Soren Madsen," he said. "You will sleep inside tonight. Tomorrow we will figure out what to do with you." She didn't answer. She stepped over the threshold, and the warmth of the room hit her like a hand on her chest, and her legs folded under her clean. He caught her before she hit the floor. He carried her to the bench by the stove without a word. He set her down like she was something he was afraid of breaking. That was the night her life began again, though neither of them knew it yet. By morning she knew his name and most of his shape. Soren Madsen, 53 years old, ran 16 head of Herefords on a high range that didn't grow enough grass to feed 12. He had a niece in his house, a girl of 9 called Birdie, who hadn't spoken a word since the summer before. He had a kitchen and a parlor and a room that had once belonged to a wife who wasn't coming back. He had a rifle. He had, she would learn, a kind of stillness inside him that looked from the outside like cold. She woke late, and Birdie was sitting on the floor beside the bench, watching her. The girl had a way of looking at a person that made you feel like you'd been read. Calliope looked back, and Birdie held out a wool sock. A single sock, folded and warm. "Thank you, child," Calliope said. Birdie didn't answer. She only nodded, once, and went back to the shoes she was mending with thread that wasn't quite the right color. Soren came in from outside with his hat pulled low and snow on his shoulders. He didn't greet her. He set a mug of coffee at her elbow. "There's porridge on the stove," he said. "I have to check on a heifer that was close to calving last night. You can stay here until I'm back." "Where will I go?" she asked. "Somewhere better than my porch, I hope." She stared after him. He didn't smile. She thought he might not know how. 2 days passed. Snow kept falling. Calliope slept on the bench the first night, and the second night Soren showed her the room with the clean sheets and the cold window and the photograph of a young woman with his eyes. "Adela," he said. "My wife. She passed 4 winters back. Pneumonia. 3 weeks from the first cough." "I'm sorry." "I am too," he said. "It isn't the kind of thing you stop being sorry for." He closed the door behind him, and she stood in the room that smelled faintly of cedar and the lavender Adela had hung in bundles between the rafters, and she cried properly for the first time since her husband had died. Not for Soren's wife. For herself. For her husband, Ezra, who had gone to town 6 weeks ago to file paperwork on their water rights and never come home. For the daughter they had buried 2 summers back at 4 years old, gone in a night of fever. For the way her own hands had begun to feel like they belonged to someone she no longer recognized. She slept that night in Adela's bed, and the dream she had was not a dream. It was Ezra's voice asking her to run, and she ran, and she woke with the sheet twisted around her like rope. She had come west from Iowa in a wagon train at 19. She had married Ezra Rennick at 22 on a bluff above the river he meant to spend his life bending. She had lost their daughter at 26. She had buried her husband at 28, on a Thursday, in a county where nobody knew her well enough to bring flowers. The man who put the dirt back had been a stranger, and he had nodded to her once. And she had known from that nod that she was going to have to learn how to be alive all over again. She had tried. She had failed. The men who came for her had come because the water rights Ezra had filed meant she owned the only clean creek for 30 miles, and the man who wanted that creek did not mean to let a woman stand in his way. His name was Dutch Cavanaugh. He ran cattle on a scale that made most ranchers in that part of Montana look like children playing at it. He had a foreman named Crane, 2 lawyers in Helena, and a quiet habit of solving problems that did not bend to his money. He had solved Ezra first. Then he had solved the deputy who was supposed to investigate the death. Now he had come for her. Soren came back at dusk the second day with a calm expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We need to talk," he said. "I'm listening. I rode into town for feed this morning. There's a man asking after a woman on foot. He's offering money for information." "What kind of money?" "Enough money that people I know told him things about my ranch just to have it in their pockets." She set her cup down. Her hands were steady. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "I am going to let you stay until they come to get you. Then I am going to be a problem they wish they hadn't made." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. For 3 more days the snow held them in. Soren went out to feed. Calliope cooked. Bertie stayed close to Calliope in a way the girl hadn't been close to anyone since the summer her mother had died in the same house. On the 4th morning, Soren came in earlier than usual and stamped the snow off his boots with more force than he usually used. "There are 4 of them," he said, riding up the south draw. "One of them is Crane." "Soren, I know what I'm about," he said. "Calliope, I need you to listen to me. I need you to take Bertie into the root cellar, and I need you to stay there with her and not come out until I tell you it's safe. And if you don't tell me, then you stay there until morning. Either way, I will come for you." What would you have done in his place? If it had been your wife they came for, would you have sent her into the cellar? He looked at her, and his jaw worked once. "No," he said, "I would not have. That's why I'm telling you to stay. Because I am the kind of fool who would have stood at the front door and died there." She looked at him for a long moment. She had not been seen like that by another person in a very long time. "All right," she said. "But Soren, if he touches you, I will go out, and I will not be quiet about it." He almost smiled. "I am counting on that," he said. The men came an hour later. What would you have done in her place? Would you have walked out through that cellar door and stood beside him, or would you have stayed where he asked you to stay? Tell us what you'd have done, because we want to know who's listening tonight. She couldn't keep the promise she had made to him. Bertie was already in the cellar. Calliope had her hand on the door when she heard the first hoofbeats on the rise. She pulled the door shut. She stood there. She could feel the cold air leaking down through the floorboards. She heard Soren step out onto the porch. She couldn't do it. She was done being hidden. She had been hidden in a marriage that swallowed her whole and left nothing. She had been hidden in grief. She had been hidden in her own kitchen by men who had decided what her life was worth. She walked out the cellar door and up the back stairs, and she stood in the kitchen window and she watched. Crane was a small man with a hard mouth. He sat his horse at the front of the porch with 3 other men behind him. "Soren Madsen," Crane said. "We're looking for a woman. Have you seen her?" "I have," Soren said. "She is in my house." "Then hand her out." "No. Boy, I am 53 years old," Soren said. "I have buried a wife. I have buried a sister. I have a 9-year-old girl upstairs who has not spoken since the funeral. I will not hand anyone anywhere. You may get off your horse, and you may try, or you may ride back the way you came and tell Dutch Cavanaugh that the woman he sent his men to kill is staying with a man who does not forget the names of men who have done what he has done." Crane's face didn't change. "Dutch won't like that answer." Then Dutch should have answered for Ezra Rennick before he came asking after Ezra's wife. The 4 men looked at each other. Crane drew his pistol halfway. He never finished drawing it. Soren's rifle came up off his shoulder so fast it seemed to come out of the air itself. The shot took Crane's hat clean off his head and threw it 6 feet into the snow. The horse spooked. Crane grabbed the saddle horn. The other 3 sat stone still. "The next shot is not at a hat," Soren said. Crane looked at him a long moment. Then he holstered his pistol, slow, the way a man does when he wants the other man to see him holster it. "We'll be back," Crane said. "I know you will," Soren said. "I will be here." They turned the horses. They went back down the draw. Soren stood on the porch until the last sound of hooves was gone, and then his shoulders came down half an inch, and Calliope realized he had been holding his breath the entire time. She opened the door. He turned. He saw her. His face did something it had probably not done in 4 years. "You weren't in the cellar," he said. "No," she said. "I wasn't. You told me you would stay." "I told you a lot of things," she said. "I'm going to stop telling you things that aren't true." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Come inside," he said. "It is too cold for this conversation." That night they sat at the kitchen table with Bertie between them, and they made a plan. The plan was small and dangerous and not at all guaranteed to work, and all three of them knew it. Dutch Kavanaugh owned the judges who owned the deputies who owned the law in that county. Soren could not beat him with a gun. He could not beat him with a fist. He could not beat him with a single letter to the territorial governor. What he could do was win him with two things Dutch did not know he had: a witness and a notebook. Calliope had found the notebook the night Ezra had died. She had found it because Ezra had hidden it. He had known. He had known what Dutch was. He had written names and dates and numbers in a leather-bound book that he had taped inside the false bottom of the trunk at the foot of their bed. She had taken the trunk when she had run. She had not looked inside it. She had been too broken to look. Now, in Soren's parlor, with Bertie watching her and Soren standing at the window, she pulled the tape off and opened the book. It was everything. Payments to Crane. Payments to the deputy. A list of 4 other men Dutch had settled. An entry for the water rights filing in Ezra's name dated 6 days before his death. An entry on the day of his death. A name she had never heard before. A signature she would know in her sleep. She set the book on the table between them. "We take this to Helena," she said. "We take it to the federal marshal. We take it before they come back." "That's 140 miles of country Dutch owns," Soren said. "We don't make that ride. Then we ride through the country he doesn't own." "There isn't any." "There is," she said. "Up through the high range. Through Cutbank. Through Pegan. We come down behind the agency. It is 3 times as far, and we will not be riding alone." He looked at her. "Who else rides with us?" "Bertie's father. Your sister's husband. Louis Adair. You told me he was a soldier who couldn't be bought." "He was." "Then he is." He said something else, something he would never say again as long as he lived, and it was the truest thing he had said in a year. He looked at her across the table, and he said, "I will die before I let them take what is yours." Calliope felt something inside her chest shift, like a bone that had been out of place for a long time finally sliding home. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They both knew what had happened between them. It wasn't love yet. It was the place love begins, the moment when two people look at each other and decide that neither of them is going to look away. If this story has been moving you tonight, you are exactly the people we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe before we go on tells us to keep bringing you stories like this one. They left 4 days later, on a morning so cold that the breath froze on the horse's nostrils before it hit the air. They had Bertie in a sling across Soren's chest. They had the notebook sewn into the lining of Calliope's coat. They had Louis Adair, who had come down out of the high country with a saddle rifle and a face like a closed door. The ride took 9 days. They lost 2 horses to ice. They lost a day to a storm on Pegan Ridge that almost took Bertie. They lost a night to Crane, who came up the South Fork with 5 men and chased them into a stand of black spruce, where Soren shot a lantern out of a man's hand at 60 yards. They made it to the agency road on the 10th morning, half-starved and frostbitten and alive. The federal marshal was a young man named Cobb who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to bring him a case like this. He read the notebook once. He excused himself. He came back in an hour with a warrant for Dutch Kavanaugh, signed in Helena. "You understand," Cobb said. "He will fight this. He has lawyers. And we have a notebook that has been signed and dated and notarized in 3 counties, Calliope said. "Take him, Marshal. Take him before he knows we rode through." They rode back. The marshal took the southern road with 11 deputies and a wagon for the prisoner. Soren and Calliope and Bertie came home the long way, because they were tired and because they had begun to understand that the long way is sometimes the right way. 2 weeks later they heard. Dutch had been arrested in his own house at sunrise, in front of his wife and his foreman and his housekeeper and the man who had been his lawyer for 20 years. Crane had been arrested at a siding south of town, trying to make it to the border. The 4 names in the notebook besides Crane had all been arrested within a fortnight. The water rights had been returned to Calliope by court order, with interest, with apology, with a silence that said all the things the court did not know how to say out loud. The money came 3 months later. Calliope bought a half-section of the adjoining land and put it under Soren's name and Bertie's. She bought books for Bertie and a piano she did not know how to play and a wedding ring she did not yet have on her hand, but would. Soren asked her on a Tuesday, in the parlor, in winter, with Bertie asleep upstairs and the fire down to its coals. He didn't have a speech. He had one line, and he said it sitting down, and his voice shook on it the way his voice shook when he had called Ezra's name in front of Crane's men. "Stay," he said, "not because you need to. Stay because I have spent this winter learning that I was not as empty as I thought I was. And you are the reason." She said yes the way you say yes to a thing you have been waiting a long time to be asked. She said yes with her whole body. She said yes, and Bertie came down the stairs in her nightgown and stood in the doorway, and then she made a sound. A small sound, not a word. The first sound she had made since the summer her mother had died. It wasn't a word exactly. It was something closer to a laugh. Bertie laughed, and Calliope dropped to her knees and pressed her face into the girl's shoulder, and Soren watched them from the chair and put his hand over his own mouth because he was not going to cry in front of a child. But he absolutely was. He cried so much his shoulders shook, and Bertie climbed into his lap and held him the way she had not held anyone in for years, and Calliope sat on the floor beside them both. The wedding was in May. It was small. Lewis came down from the high country. 2 neighbors came from over the ridge. A preacher rode 12 miles on a mule to be there. They stood in the parlor because the parlor smelled of cedar and lavender, and it was the room Adela had loved, and it was the room Soren had said goodbye to her in, and it was right that it was the room where he began again. Bertie carried the rings on a little cedar tray she had carved herself. She was 11 years old, and she had begun to speak again, slowly, a word at a time, only when she had something real to say. After the wedding, Soren and Calliope sat on the porch while the preacher ate supper inside, and the creek ran below the bluff the way it had run when Ezra had first bent it to his will, and the land that had tried to destroy her did not look any different from any other land. But she looked at it differently, and Soren reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him. And the warmth of his palm against hers was the warmth of a thing finally come home. A year after that, in late summer, with Bertie 13 and reading the books Calliope had bought her at a wooden table by the kitchen window, with the new foals running in the south pasture and the creek running clean and the photograph of Ezra on the mantel beside the photograph of Adela, with Soren standing in the doorway holding a mug of coffee because he did still. After everything, never sleep past dawn. The morning light fell across the kitchen like a hand laid gently on the head of a child who had been behaving patiently for a very long time. And Bertie looked up from her book, and Calliope looked up from the braid she was weaving into Bertie's hair, and they both looked at Soren as if to say the same thing, which was that the man in the doorway was, and had always been, the answer to a question the world had never thought to ask, and some folks are worth the long ride you have to take to find them, and some folks are worth the long ride you have to take to become the person they were waiting for. Next, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman who is sent to a remote ranch because her family is ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who takes her and begins to see her in a way no one ever has. Settle in. The next story is already waiting.